As this is, conference has reversed itself and is more online, I'm going to go straight to Slido questions if I can. I think we've got several. I will need to take a microphone over to our Slido question asker, and we've got online with us all of our last three speakers.
So we have plenty of questions specific for each speaker. So let's start with Suzanne. We have two questions, one from Lina from South Africa and Brayonyoshi from Australia about does sandbags see opportunity for CO2 emission reduction in industrial symbiosis, and how can this be related to policy? And also, Brayon is asking if you can expand on the BCA work you have been doing as a decarbonization mechanism.
Suzanne, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just, if it's possible to start with the last question, because then I'll have a clarifying one for the first question. So on the BCA work, we started really during the previous ETS revision. For a long time now, we had been carrying out studies looking at sometimes including the windfall profits that European industries were able to make by playing the rules in the EU ETS. So many of our reports actually, I think, I hope they informed the legislative process, because many of the problems were indeed fixed. So it won't be able to do exactly the same sort of lowering of output to retain but still retaining a high level of allocation in the next phase. But nonetheless, this is what was happening. So in 2016 already, we produced a report on the possibility of introducing a BCA for the cement sector. And I should say that an amendment for this passed the European Parliament's vote both in its Environmental Committee and the Industrial Committee. So both the specialized committees of the European Parliament considered a BCA to be a more suited policy tool than the continuation of free allocation for this particular industry. But unfortunately, this didn't make it to the final text. And so what we're seeing right now is quite an interesting development in Europe, whereby, in fact, the cement industry as well as the steel industry are leading the conversation themselves, because they are starting to see the benefits of this tool, so now we're actually having an industry-led discussion, which was eventually picked up by the political level. And so we have had the opportunity to then come back to this debate, which we had left 2 years ago, as it was sort of killed with a parliament vote. But yes, so just in December 2019, we published 2 reports on the BCA, a BCA for the electricity sector, looking at all the electricity imports into the European Union, and one that deals precisely with industrial sectors. So we have quite a good analysis. If you're interested, I'm happy to send it through. But as to kind of what the implications would be, how what could be done with the tax, how the tax could be measured, yes, and different analysis of impacts. And for the first question, just to understand symbiosis, you're referring to the cross-applicability of one solution from one sector to then other sectors. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So that is something we've very much tried to develop in this previous call for evidence, and we did ask our respondents precisely what sort of solutions did they see their own sector could provide to the other sectors, and how exactly could we develop sustainable standards that maybe cut across, and we had this idea of a Rubik's Cube type of toolbox. So, you know, the moment you start aligning the pieces in a coherent way, then you see the responses on all the faces of the cube, so to say. But unfortunately, we've only really heard back from maybe 1 or 2 of the respondents on this question. So I have the impression it's quite an underdeveloped field. And I mean, I think we see it as definitely a potential for EU policy sort of synergic approach intervention. So maybe trying to encourage this in the innovation fund. So the Innovation Fund could in fact support such cross-applicability instead of just being set on supporting top 10 current best performers, let's say, but looking precisely into the unexplored terrain between the industries. So yes, I think that's a massive area to develop further. Unfortunately, I don't really know of many examples beyond the two that we received in our call for evidence. So if there's more examples, then we need to make a better we need to make a better case for them and for making them known.
Thanks, Susanna. More Slido questions.
So there is a question for Robert about from US about any plans to have university representation on the Energy Transition Commissions.
Thanks. That's a good question. Actually, it's maybe not obvious from the title slide, but the London School of Economics, LSE, is actually already a member, and the commissioner there is Nick Stern. So I think it's absolutely open to universities. I think we'd be looking for a commissioner with a sort of track record around the kind of low carbon agenda. From a sort of membership perspective, the kind of key economies now are India and China. So I would put a bet on if there was another university member joining, would probably come from one of those two countries as a priority. But yes, we already have one, and we'd certainly be open to others.
We might take one more Slido question and then swap to this room.
Yes, so there is one question for everyone about biomass. So are there any known market mechanisms or policies to treasure resource too difficult to decarbonize areas over more easily decarbonized ones for everyone?
Are there any questions here? I know there are a lot more Slido ones. While people are thinking here, we might have one more Slido question if we could.
Yeah, well, on that triage question, I'll have to volunteer a couple of perspectives. I'm a big fan of the marginal abatement cost curves, which were developed by McKinsey in the late 2000s by Jeremy Oppenheim and others, and he's also a member of the ETC. I think trying to compare using an economic basis is good, and if you take a sort of total cost perspective, then that does help you prioritize. But I think there are issues around biomass, around some of the indirect land use effects and transportation effects, which are hard to capture solely economically. So I think it's kind of MAC curve plus look at other sort of social and environmental impacts that are hard to capture economically.
One more Slido question, or perhaps two Slido questions, and then we'll go to Gus.
So there is a question for Jason about from Dominic S. from Australia that agree with you about the focus shouldn't be only technological, but also politics, social license, ability to collaborate is critical to make everything works. And the question is, how do we do this effectively? And what should be our key job over the next 2 years?
Well, I think one of the crucial things is for there to be collaboration between industry, government, academia, research, as well as civil society. And I think a key focus should be on creating a platform to drive that collaboration, exchange, and learning. I think that's the way you can encapsulate all these non-technological perspectives and really start working with the system to transition together.
Gus Nathan.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for great presentations. Rob, in particular, I was very appreciative of the data you presented. You gave some really good data showing that it's a large relative barrier for industry to decarbonise, but it's globally it's not such a big effort. So the question is, can you give some good examples of where there are some specific investments or some opportunities that are helping to overcome this barrier, and things that we can learn of how to unlock some of the relatively large global investment that's possible into actually making these investments for specific cases? Have you got some examples or some opportunities you could think of as to how this may happen in practice?
Yeah, I mean, there is a good example around steel production in Sweden. And I mean, Sweden's a country that's already made great progress in decarbonising generally. So, massive availability of low-cost renewable power, but also as a country with, pretty stable politics, long-standing kind of green sort of agendas in Swedish governments. And there's a decision that they just recognizing that it will be a more expensive commodity, they're going to transition steel production to a net zero basis. And so there's an alignment of industrial players, politics, and civil society. So they brought the kind of voters along with them. And of course, it helps having Greta Thunberg as a Swedish person as well. So this is happening, and you're starting to see people sort of recognizing the benefits of green components in in the eventual products in vehicles and other uses of steel. So Sweden's a great case study. But I just think more trivially in things like apparel, this shoe brand Allbirds that uses sustainable components. There's a huge consumer appetite, really developed in the last maybe 2 or 3 years since net zero, since the BBC ocean plastics things. Consumers are now ready to pay a premium for these green products. You're seeing that translate all the way back up the value chain in Sweden, but we're starting to see it elsewhere. People like Microsoft and other large tech companies saying they want to kind of offset or double offset their emissions. So we're at a tipping point now where I think these investments are possible. But I think certainly there is Sweden and other Scandinavian countries are great places to look for case studies.
Chris Matthews.
Thank you. My question is fairly fundamental, but the economists I really need to hear an answer to this. All of the reports that I've seen, whether it's Europe or Australia, talk about green hydrogen, and they only talk about one way to get it, which is zapping water with electricity. Now, when we talk about the pathway, and Cedric said this earlier, the pathway is the main mechanism to get things down to $2 a kilogram is lowering the cost of electricity. So we need, and I've heard numbers like we need electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour at massive, massive scale, like gigawatts and gigawatts of electricity at really, really cheap prices to get enough, to get a mechanism so that hydrogen is at $2 a kilogram. Now, that unnerves me greatly because first of all, I'm not sure the last time power prices went down, but it's been a while from my memory, and I can't see it getting to 3 cents, certainly in Australia, and certainly not at that scale. How are we going to do it? And is there a plan B if the world can't get electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour at gigantic scale? What is the plan B if that doesn't happen? Because we don't have very long.
Susanna, do you want to answer that?
Well, it's quite interesting that on one hand, I mean, to some extent, yes, it's about getting the green hydrogen by electricity, but at the same time, at least the EU is investing in other pilot projects, which also lead to hydrogen. So, for example, solar fuels that Horizon 2020 is sponsoring. So, my impression is that by actually developing several options for green hydrogen, you're actually creating a market that then leads the costs as well. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the focus will be in creating the different modalities of obtaining the green hydrogen, and that we shouldn't just be completely stuck on electrolysis and electrolyzers, and so because that in itself, if we're having just kind of one idea on the market, and that requires specific it doesn't lead to necessarily lowering the costs. So I think this is, at least that's my understanding of what the EU is planning to do. So right now, yes, let's deploy what we have available at the prices available, while trying to lower them, but at the same time, very much trying to develop alternatives, which then can compete with each other.
Robert, do you want to expand on this? And then perhaps
Sure,
Jason, I think it's a very important question.
It's an incredibly important area. Thanks, Mike. So actually, I have a sort of slightly contrarian view to most people in the space. I don't think electrolyzers are anywhere near ready. And just a simple fact. So the total global production of electrolyzer capacity last year was 114 megawatts, right? So if you think of solar or wind, we're talking about hundreds of gigawatts a year. And people are scaling up NEL and so on and building factories. But when you go and talk to people who are producing steel and petrochemicals, they cannot buy an electrolyzer that's anywhere near large enough. So I think we're maybe best part of a decade away from large quantities of electrolytic hydrogen. And having BP, Shell, etc. on the ETC allows you to access to, we produce 60 million tons of hydrogen a year, and that's used in refinery and petrochemicals. So our assumption, and that's also the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, is for the near future, near to medium future, it's going to be SMR with CCS, SMR ATR with CCS. And we're going to need CCS. You need it for things like a lot of the cement. Yes, do it thoughtfully. But certainly the UK final energy mix for 2050 is projected to be 2/3 power, 1/3 hydrogen. At the moment, the central planning for the Committee on Climate Change in the UK is that's all coming from natural gas with CCS. As electrolyzers come through and deliver a capability to produce low-cost hydrogen, taking into account the absolutely very good points around the cost of power, then that's going to change. But I think people are getting overexcited about electrolyzers for large volumes of hydrogen. They will come, but slower. And we can't ignore the availability of natural gas with CCS as a much nearer term solution.
Jason, do you want to add anything? Or no? The elephant in the room, of course, is that through some sort of carbon price, whether it's through a trading system, that the price of carbon emissions might go to $100 a tonne or something, and then your current price of 3 cents becomes 50 cents, whatever, depending on what happens. We do have that choice, and that's why economists often talk about emissions trading schemes. And the other one is, even as often talked about in the OECD, the removal of subsidies for the production of carbon-emitting types of energy, and they around the world globally are still massive. So there are two options. One is to remove all of the subsidies for dirty industry, and secondly, to then start making dirty industry pay for the cost of the pollution they put into the atmosphere. That's the economic theory. There are very few politicians who are prepared to talk about massive taxes on carbon emissions at this stage. We have one more Slido question and then two questions here. I'm letting this run about another 3 or 4 minutes because we had a hiccup at the start, meaning we'll have slightly less time for lunch. One Slido question and then two here very quickly, and I'm going to take both those questions together.
We have a question from Ray Chatfield from Alcoa. Is asking about energy-intensive trade-exposed industry. In Australia, energy-intensive trade-exposed industry have been protected so far by carbon credits for fossil fuel emissions. So that means they are not having to pay renewable energy credits. If a future zero-carbon pathway is electrification and the government no longer see the needs to promote renewables using RECs, thus increasing the cost of power to this kind of industry, how will industry then be protected? It needs to be considered in the context of carbon leakage, in his opinion. I would like to get comments from the speaker.
Any comments from any of the speakers? Susanna.
Yeah, I actually had already sort of indicated I would have liked to build on what Mike has said just earlier, because I actually think that in a way that the two are connected. But on the carbon leakage question, I think what we're looking at, right, the idea that subsidies are there to protect against carbon leakage. So this came up in Mike's intervention, and of course, that's exactly why I didn't refer to carbon pricing as a way to support this, because as it stands, there's just so many subsidies that effectively don't let it act as it could, and also you're having the net zero industries like the steel example that Robert referred to from Sweden. It actually is at a disadvantage because it doesn't get the subsidies. So now what would be an alternative? Well, in our position, net zero, the idea of net zero changes entirely the carbon leakage conversation, because we're no longer looking at the possibility of relocating, let's say, possibly relocating because the price would be lower. We're looking towards zero. The question is zero going to be reached in 2050, or is it going to be 2055 or 2060 in other jurisdictions? But nonetheless, we're looking, okay, to net zero, fine, okay. But nonetheless, it does fundamentally change the sort of choices and discussions we're having. And so this is why we're actually proposing a BCA, because we think that a BCA, a border carbon adjustment, is the only way that you can actually have and support industry achieve net zero in the jurisdiction that it's meant to be in, let's say. So if Europe introduces one, the view is no longer to protect its industry from carbon leakage because of the carbon price, but rather because of the sort of net zero idea. And so in that sense, the carbon price is an absolutely crucial point of reaching net zero. But then, of course, you need to find a way to have it at least being sort of leveled out at the global scene, at the global area. Yeah, level. Sorry, it's 3:30 a.m. But
Have to learn to
so
watch the speakers down here.
The answers are we need to rethink many of the former sort of carbon markets mechanisms that we had in mind, and I think the credits and the carbon leakage are no longer really the crucial bit of it. I think the idea is we need carbon prices that work, but we also need to make sure that we have a way to take them into account in when we shift the goods across jurisdictions. But that's the climate NGO think tank vision.
Thanks, Suzanne. A question here.
Yes.
Where's the microphone?
Yes. John Salapatis from Australia. I'd like to link a few questions, actually. Well, one question, but from your presentation. Robert, you mentioned for the hard-to-abate industries like cement in your 2050 projection you did. You talked about a big decrease in cement output. Susanna, in her discussion, talked about the European experience of their abatement in the steel industry, and it's really been a comment about the fact that they've actually produced less, and that's the way they've saved in terms of, iconically anyway. And Jason's comment about dragging your heels. So one of the questions was, or the question was, in the future projections to 2050, is Europe looking at a production output of equivalent standard or output to current when they're looking at the projections, or are we looking at an ultra-efficient green industry of very low production output? And to finish off with Robert's comment, you mentioned Sweden, and Sweden currently and in the future has got a very modest output of hot metal and steel. It's a very good quality, but it's a modest output by their steelmaking plants, both in Sweden currently and into the future. So that would mean they're ultra green, but not very high output, which means in terms of their contribution to the world steel production, it wouldn't be a massive contribution. And then to Jason's point, the people that would be dragging their heels then in the future would possibly be having a larger share of an output which wouldn't be as green. Is that understood as a question? So are we talking about declining amounts of production into the future, or are we based on per tonne outputs for the various countries and regions?
Robert, as you answer that, can I ask you to talk about global population increases as well and the challenges sitting in behind that? Robert.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. So it's a good question. And I was hopping around a bit between EU and China data in the presentation. I think the chart you're referring to is around China. But that was why at the beginning of the presentation, I was making these points around demand reduction, so demand per useful service. So if you look at what's driven a lot of the consumption of steel and cement in the last decade has been huge amounts of built infrastructure in places like China, steel used in construction as well as automotive. And the asset efficiency of a lot of those artifacts is not great. So people who know China will know about these huge apartment blocks that are empty. And people will be aware in things like passenger vehicles, so the LDV passenger car typically use less than 4% of the time. So a future economy with carbon priced into these capital goods would see them as more valuable and ideally with digital business models used more efficiently. So we are assuming in our costings within the ETC of how much it will cost to get to net zero, that we start using assets made out of steel, aluminium, cement, etc., more efficiently. Whether that's achieved through some sort of pricing or regulation, it's hard to say. But it is absolutely the case that current processes, particularly in very fast-growing economies, are wasteful. And it is going to be very much more expensive to decarbonize if we can't address that. We are very confident that we can address some of that wastefulness without any impact on economic growth and standards of living. So to answer your question, it's both. And if you only do the carbon intensity per kilo per ton, the job is much harder. We should take low-hanging fruits on demand reduction as well. And we assume that China will get there. China's waking up to that, and certainly the conversations that we're having in that country.
We have time for two more questions. I can take them both together. Can I take one here from the floor? Keep them short, and then one Slido one. Slido first.
I'm not sure if you hear me, but I might just add something there, which I think is relevant to the question or comment that was just made, and in particular to Sweden. Even the question that came to me previously, I think that it's really important to emphasize the value that these pilots and demonstrations can play in the transition to decarbonisation future. So Sweden, with steel and in other sectors, they play a role not just in their own sectors but globally. I think Sweden is one of the first countries to move because it's production costs are very high there. They have a lot of knowledge, and they can get a first mover advantage and increase their premium, so to speak. And hopefully this can help the transition globally. But I think these, just to emphasize the value of these place-based demonstrations are enormous, and often they require governments working with industry and working with academia and research. So I think, they shouldn't be undervalued.
Thanks, Jason. Very quickly from Slido. You're on.
Yep. We have a quick one about biomass. So the question is, biomass is currently heavily used in low temperature process for pulp and paper plus sugar. But if there is any key relevant project looking to diverting this kind of biomass, such as heat pump or solar thermal, they would like to hear more about it.
Anyone want to answer that? If you put your hand up or signal either the question. Susanna? Robert?
Well, so we have worked a bit on the topic of biomass, but maybe not for that specific applicability. In the EU, it's unfortunately labeled as a 100% renewable. So as a green think tank, we've tried to shift that a bit. And what we're seeing, and it's interesting to hear about an example from the agricultural sector, but what we're seeing is that the sheer scale of what companies are planning for, let's say, a timeline such as 2040 is significant enough to actually push the decision makers and the final policy debate around this problem. So just if there's a way to show just how much is planning on being used until 2030 or 2040, I think that's a very good way to start the conversation for the need to find solutions to this problem. Yeah. But have a look on our website because we have a lot of stuff on biomass, yes.
It's time for us to wrap up, unfortunately. Before closing, Jason, one thing that I've just been involved in looking outside, and it's sometimes useful to look in other industries. I'm just about to release a report looking at the water industry in Australia and looking at the question of lock-in. And the government has been protecting the irrigation industry and pumping money into there, hoping they would invest in their local regions. We've just worked out if instead of doing that, they had given the money directly to the regions, they would have got 9 times greater benefit. And I think in terms of transitions, the comment you made, Robert, about looking at regional pressures and resistance to change, and the German process now of going into the coal regions and supporting the regions rather than the coal industry is a powerful approach, and there needs to be a lot more global discussion on that. As time's out, on behalf of you all, can I ask you to thank Jennifer, Susanna and Robert for excellent presentations from afar. And I think we're in a new world where a lot of these conferences are going to be like this. So thank you very, very much.